how was the Battle of Long Tan fought from the company commander's perspective? We discuss the battle with Lieutenant Colonel Harry Smith.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Principles of War podcast. This is episode 56, The Battle of Long Tan with Harry Smith. Very honoured to continue on with our podcast interview with Lieutenant Colonel Harry Smith, who was the OC of Delta Company 6RAR at the Battle of Long Tan. The previous two episodes, we've talked a little bit about his career leading up to his deployment to Vietnam. We've talked about the training regime that he put together, both when he was at 2 Company and after he'd taken over Delta Company 6RAR in preparation for the move to Vietnam. This episode, we will start to go through the battle in a little bit of detail to give you an idea of how it was that Harry fought the battle. If Harry's interview whets your appetite for a little bit more understanding of the Battle of Long Tan, then definitely check out his book, The Battle of Long Tan, The Company Commander's Story. It gives an excellent account of Harry's entire career in the Army, lots of things that you can learn from his career. So let's pick up the story on the 18th of August, 1966, with Delta just about to go outside the wire to relieve Bravo, who'd been out on patrol. What was your actual mission when you went out to relieve Bravo, and was there any what sort of intelligence picture were you given as you left the base?
We went out with a mission to try and locate the enemy, which had shelled, when I say shelled, colloquially mortared and rocket launched the base the night before, and see if we could track them down and locate them and kill them. So that was our mission, and we were to take over from Bravo Company, which had gone out and still had a platoon out there with Bravo Company headquarters, and we met up with them, and I was briefed by Noel Ford as to what they'd found and seen, and then they left and went back towards Nui Dat. We didn't get the intelligence that the task force headquarters commander had that there was possibly an enemy regiment to the east of the Long Tan rubber plantation. That was never passed down.
So in your mind, the likely enemy was significantly smaller than that then?
Oh, I remember saying to the CO, Colin Townsend, he said to me, "What do you reckon's out there?" I said, "Well, I was listening to the radio conversations between Bravo Company platoons and yourself, and they found X number of mortar bases and rocket launcher positions." I said, I think probably is no more than maybe 30 or 40 enemy set up their weapons, fired on the task force base at 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever it was. I think it was 2:30 in the morning, and fled east. Noel Ford found that the task force, of course, fired counter-bombardment fire on the suspected enemy positions. The positions were determined by soldiers and officers in the task force base at Nui Dat taking compass bearings to pinpoint the sound of the firing, and the pop, 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 pop from the mortars and so forth. And they had a reasonably good idea where they had come out of the rubber and fired from the edge of the rubber towards Nui Dat. So that's where they sent Bravo Company out, and that's where we went to take over from Bravo Company, because they weren't fully equipped with rations or equipment, whereas we went out fully equipped for a 10-day patrol.
And that's a good sized task. So a platoon plus that's a good task for a company, well and truly within your means.
Yeah, yep. I reckon we could handle 20, 30, 40 Viet Cong. We didn't have any idea that they were regular forces, which were much more highly trained and experienced than the local, VC Viet Cong around the base.
Had the initial scare that the base was going to be under attack, had that faded away in the after an attack didn't materialise?
Yes, well, we now know from the enemy's history, and I spoke to the enemy when I was over in Vietnam in 4 years ago for the 50th anniversary, and I met up with some of the former enemy commanders. And they were very friendly, and we got down to syntax as far as what was happening and so forth. And they were going to attack the Nui Dat base right from the word go, but then decided not to. They shot down an aeroplane which was just to the north of the 5 Battalion position and north of Nui Dat, and then they set an ambush, and they expected 5 Battalion to go out and see what went on, but 5 Battalion didn't go out. So that didn't happen, so the Vietnam withdrew to the north and didn't come back. And they didn't come back to the task force base until they were going to attack it at Long Tan Day, shall we say, because if we hadn't run into them, I believe they would have attacked the task force base that night.
So, just before we get into the battle then, what was Nui Dat looking like as you marched out? So, you've got 5 RAR still there, 6 Bravos down to a platoon. How well developed, and so Nui Dat had only been established for a couple of months at that stage, really?
Yeah, that's right.
And a high tempo, developing positions, but not overly well developed, really, is it? It's still very much in the development stage as far as a defensive position goes. Would that be correct?
Oh yeah, look, exactly right. Yes, we had trenches in the platoon areas. We had very little wire, no mines, and very little to protect the base from an attack by regular forces. And it wasn't until after the Battle of Long Tan that the hierarchy believed this could happen again, and we then set about putting up decent wire, low wire and high wire, and mines out the front and claymores and so forth, so that should the enemy attack Nui Dat, then at least we had a fair chance of knocking a few before they got into the forward defensive lines.
Interesting. So back to what you've just taken over from Bravo. They're down to a platoon, and you think that the platoon plus that you're chasing, you think that they've gone to the east.
Noel pointed out the blood trails and ox cart tracks that they could have taken away casualties, because the counter bombardment from the task force artillery, obviously the enemy that was still in the area, and that night from where they'd fired, and we now know in discussions with the enemy that they lost 2 killed and 8 wounded, and they buried the 2 killed where they were, and they put the others in this ox cart and then wheeled the ox cart off to the east. And we were able to see the tracks, and Noel Ford pointed them out to us, and we thought it was a fairly good assumption that the enemy had withdrawn to the east, and that's the way we went.
So what happened then?
Well, I gave orders and put the company on the ground, and I had a personal policy of keeping soldiers 10 metres apart, and there was no doubt in my mind that that's the way we should go, particularly through the rubber, which was open, and in jungle we might close it down a bit. And we set off, and the company was something like 4 sections up front, 400 metres across the front and 400 metres deep, with a 10 platoon on the left, 11 platoon on the right, and 4 platoon was behind company headquarters, protecting the rear, shall we say, and company headquarters in the support section in the middle. And we set off and we advanced very slowly to the east, aware that the enemy could be there. We advanced slowly to the east, and we were crossing a road, or the leading platoon, the 11th platoon was crossing a road that ran from south to north, basically an ox cart track and dirt road, and they were fired on, or they didn't fire, so they fired on about 8 local VC that were seen walking up the track towards them. Bob Buick knocked over a couple and with his soldiers, and the rest of them ran off to the east, and they obviously ran into the jungle where the regiment was based. They decided to come forward and see what was happening and who had, coming into their area being the fact that they were the local inhabitants, and were both moving towards each other, and then we ran into it. The 11th platoon ran into the leading group of an enemy regiment, and not that I suspect that the regiment was all there at any one time. Knocked over, unfortunately, about half of the 11th platoon were killed or wounded. Eventually, it took some time to get 11th platoon back to 12th platoon, and then everybody back to where company headquarters was, and form up a defensive position. We had just started to form up one, and there was pop, 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 pop from down south, and a number of 50mm or 60mm mortars landed nearby. So I said, out of here. So I had the company move to the northeast about 300 metres behind the top of a hill. In other words, we were on a reverse slope situation, and we formed a company defensive position there and waited for the enemy to advance. The enemy, of course, wasn't quite sure where we were. Having spoken to some of them 4 years ago, they couldn't quite come to terms with where we were, and they fired up where they thought we were, and eventually located us, and then started launching attacks on our base, on our company base.
How did the battle escalate? How quickly did it go from 11 platoon giving pursuit to an enemy section through to them becoming decisively engaged, then taking those casualties? How quickly did that occur?
Fairly quickly. 11 platoon followed up the enemy that ran to the east, and the enemy had moved forward to investigate what was going on, and they ran into 11 platoon. It wasn't an ambush as such. They just encountered each other, and the enemy fired. They had more people than 11 platoon on the ground. They had machine guns, a wheeled machine gun, and they knocked over half of 11 platoon before they could do anything about it. And then we had the problem of getting 11 platoon out. I got Jeff Kendall's platoon, 10 platoon, which was over on the left, or the northern side, to go forward and go around to the right and try and get in behind the enemy and help 11 platoon withdraw. But he started off, and they ran into enemy coming off the avenue that featured to the north, and they had a firefight there, and I said, that's no good. So I got Jeff Kendall to bring his platoon back to company headquarters and sent David Sabin's platoon off around to the right, go around the other flank and try to get in behind 11 platoon, which they partially succeeded. They got up to about 80 metres from them. Eventually, Bob Buick, the platoon sergeant, was able to get the survivors of 11 platoon back to 12, and they all came back to company headquarters, and we formed a defensive position. And it took some time for the enemy to locate us and launch attacks on us.
Who was controlling the artillery as the battle developed? So you had Maury Stanley with you, your New Zealand FO. How was he providing support to the platoons? Because you effectively had your platoons spread out fairly widely. How was he able to manage that, providing support for them?
Yeah, Maury travelled with me, and Maury and I lay side by side in the wet rubber, I can remember, and we had trouble getting the maps, references off our maps, which were sprayed with mud from the monsoonal rain. But Maury did a wonderful job, and he talked to the platoon commanders on the radio, and they would indicate where they wanted the fire or where they wanted to move it to. I also told Maury that I wanted fire over here or over there or somewhere, and he would adjust the fire. He initially only had the 6 guns of 161 New Zealand battery, and then I told him to get the rest of the regiment in support, which was initially refused, but I insisted. I remember the CO said, leave the guns to the gunners, and I said, well, give me every gun they've got. Eventually we got the whole regiment firing in support. So we had like 18 105s and another 6 155s, which were firing in depth because the artillery headquarters wouldn't let the 155s fire close support. These days, of course, the 155 is the close support weapon of the Australian Army.
Indeed, yes.
Maury was able to put the artillery where we wanted it, and as the enemy assaulted, we would bring the artillery down on top of them, knock half of them over, and they would withdraw and reorganise and come in again. So that went on, and the enemy never got inside our forward defensive lines at all. The artillery and my own soldiers fired 10,500 rounds that day, and there's no doubt that artillery didn't kill all the enemy that were left on the battlefield. They left 245 behind. Everybody suggested, in fact, at one stage of the game, I think the artillery suggested it was an artillery battle and Delta Company simply protected the artillery group, but that wasn't quite right. But my soldiers, as I said, fired 10,500 rounds, and a lot of those took a toll on the enemy. The enemy later on revealed in 1969 on the second tour of 2RR, they got into the enemy's base up in the Nelly Moto Mountains and found documents, and it indicated that of those that were killed and left on the battlefield, and those that were dragged away, and of course it was the enemy's philosophy to take away as many casualties as they could, not to allow the Allied troops to guesstimate how many casualties they suffered. But they got knocked around so much at Long Tan, they left 245 on the battlefield. They buried another 48 and some weapons just to the east, and then we don't know how many other mass graves there were, but the Arvin forces told us that they found other mass graves on the way up to their home base at Murimoto. And the document said that a total of 876 soldiers were lost, either killed at the battle or died from wounds. So that's a fairly good haul.
It's not a bad effort at all. How close were you bringing the artillery in then? In the movie and in the sort of popular culture, there's a little bit of talk about how close the artillery was controlled to within the front line of friendly troops. How close was it coming in?
Well, we were lucky in that the artillery was behind us, back at Meridat, and all the shells were going over our heads, and the shrapnel was therefore going forward and going to the east when the shell burst on the ground, or tree bursts, not the same. So we were able to drop the artillery down. I think I did say to Morris Stanley once when there was a large enemy assault coming in, I said, drop 50. And Morris said, drop 50, and it was countermanded by the artillery headquarters back at Meridat and said, you can't, it's unsafe. And I said, shit, unsafe? Here's these turkeys back at base in a comfortable command post telling me it's unsafe, and we're in the middle of a bloody fight. And I said something appropriate, and Murray then said, yes, well, you've got the full regiment there.
What was the initial problem with getting the full regiment in support? Do you know what the concern was there?
I really don't know. I think it was, when I asked for the regiment, it was unusual, of course, for a company to have a regiment in support. The battalion had one battery, 161 battery, and the New Zealand battery, and when I up and said, no, I want the other two batteries and the American 155s, the whole regiment, people said, what do you think he's trying to do? There's never been a regimental mission since Korea. Then again, you see, they weren't aware that we were being attacked by the best part of a North Vietnamese regiment. Anyway, I said my piece and I got what I wanted.
Excellent. What about air support? Was any air support available?
Well, air support was available, but I did ask for air support. Unfortunately, the monsoonal rain and cloud was such that the air support arrived overhead, and the forward air controller and spoke to my company on radio, and I had my signaller, Graham Smith, talk to him, and we threw smoke to identify where we were so they could put the air support rockets and bombs outside the area. And the forward air controller in the aeroplane said, we can't see your smoke. And of course, in those days, we weren't smart enough to be able to fly airplanes as well as have artillery, whereas in Afghanistan now they have artillery flying at the same time as they have air support by firing in different directions and flying a different way, but we weren't able to do that. The theory in Vietnam was airplanes in the air, no artillery, so I had to get the artillery back, and I told the battalion to take the aircraft away and give me back the artillery, which we did.
Ladies and gents, we'll leave the interview here, and we've probably got about another 2 episodes of the interview with Harry when we'll cover off on some of the other aspects of the battle.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.